Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Kading. I'm with K2 Site Assessments, and I'll be your presenter today. We're going to talk about Phase 1 environmental site assessments and how to make sure your contaminated properties get identified and you don't get any surprises where you have to do depositions and talk to nasty lawyers. A quick background on me, if you missed my last presentation on water availability in Yavapai County, I have a 33-year career doing environmental consulting work. I've worked in 34 states. I do a lot of Phase 1 work, Phase 2. We're going to talk about all these things that we do. But I try to keep this as jargon-free as possible. There's lots of jargon when it comes to hazardous waste, and I'll try to minimize that. If I say something that's an acronym or something you don't understand, just jot it down, and at the end, we'll cover it during questions. I hope you get something out of this presentation, and if you've ever been bitten by a hazardous waste issue on a site, then you probably already know this. But we'll try to cover it as quickly as we can and go forward. I've got a project example too that we're going to go through a little bit later, so you'll get some real life stuff as well. So here we go. Phase 1. So a Phase 1 report is basically a risk reduction tool. It basically outs issues and concerns so that both parties can come to an agreement before closing and everything is handled in an above board way. The way that a Phase 1 is operated, it gathers known regulatory, there's 4 aspects to it, and I'm going to talk about this on the next slide. But there's 4 aspects to this investigation, and it's looking at known regulatory information about hazardous materials on or near a site. This is augmented by historical source review, interviews with site operators and managers, and a field reconnaissance by an environmental professional. I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. The purpose of the Phase 1 study is to identify RECs, recognized environmental conditions, or conditions that would cause a regulatory agency with jurisdiction to require some kind of action, a cleanup, a documentation, some kind of site control, etc. A REC, that's the bottom line of the Phase 1. This is all driven and guided by the American Society of Testing and Materials E1527 conforming standard. It basically lays out, here's how you do a Phase 1. So that the proper steps can be followed and the proper people with the right qualifications can do the work. So ASTM E1527, I didn't like it when it first came out because I didn't like some agency telling me how I had to do it, but it's become my friend over the years because it really does make these Phase 1s consistent across all the providers that do them, or fairly consistent. So the 4 investigative elements of the Phase 1 investigation that you need to be aware of. Known regulatory information. So the way that this data is usually gathered, it's a series of databases, federal, state, local, tribal databases that contain information about hazardous waste spills and issues on properties. These usually come from a vendor. I used to do all of these steps myself and go through all the databases years ago. Now there are vendors that basically can aggregate this information for you very quickly and efficiently, and they provide a report to the environmental professional that we review. Now, it's important to understand that environmental records were kept by governments after about 1988. Before 1988, most states didn't care, didn't know about, didn't have regulations. So the records didn't start to be collected until 1988, which brings me to the importance of the second element of the investigation, which is the historical source review. So pre-1988, we look at historical sources to try to find information that might indicate a hazardous waste issue. This is where the experience of a Phase 1 practitioner really comes into play because aerial photography, for example, if I'm looking at an aerial photograph from 1957, you've got to kind of be able to infer hazardous waste issues based upon the images you see from 10,000 feet up. Aerial photographs are like gold if they're really good photos. And they go back to about World War II. There's a few photographs that go back a little further. But really the 50s, 60s, 70s, which was the heart of the industrial boom after World War II, is well captured in aerial photographs. City directories, as realtors, you may be familiar with city directories. They used to call these crisscross directories, where it was like a phone book, but it had different sections with different colored pages that would take a property and list it by address in one color. It would address it by phone number in another one. It would address it by business name in another one. So you can look at a property and look at the addresses around it and see what businesses may have operated on it. City directories were common from the 1920s until about 1975. They stopped making them. So you see that we've got overlapping data years that we can look at these things. Sanborn maps, Sanborn fire insurance maps were prepared from the 1890s through the late 1960s. And what these maps were was they sent generally young men out across the country to make detailed maps of cities, details all the way down to where a storage tank on a property might be. They did this for fire insurance rating. They had no idea that people like me would look at this data decades later and get a lot of value out of it. Because if I'm concerned about something that happened on a property in 1915, city directories, Sanborn maps are probably going to be my only source. Another great source of information that we often go to, and I say this because my mother was a librarian, but we also go to the local library. Archives in your local library are a treasure trove of information about old businesses. Historical societies can also be quite useful. And there's almost always an elderly librarian named Beverly or Eunice that can point you to the right source if you can't find it yourself. Whoops. I don't know what happened there. Hang on. Okay. The third element of a phase one investigation is interviews. We try to interview people that may have knowledge of a facility's current or historic uses, focusing on waste handling. In small towns, I love to get a hold of some 90-year-old guy that's got a great memory because he'll remember things that'll help fill in the gaps that we can't get from other sources. And local on-the-ground information or site-specific interviews is often the best source that we have to get older information. And the fourth element of the phase one is a site reconnaissance. This is where an environmental professional, let me define that for you. ASTM defines an environmental professional as someone that has a certain amount of training, experience, education that fits the criteria to be an environmental professional. The minimum is 3 years of experience plus a degree. So there's a lot of firms out there that do this and they call themselves EPs and they may or may not really qualify. But when I say EP, I'm referring to the environmental professional that's qualified to do the phase one. So in the site reconnaissance, that person goes to the property, thoroughly goes over everything, looks at it. We look for signs of contamination. You'd be surprised what we can find just by walking around and looking. Stained soil is the obvious example. Unknown pipes that go into the ground, those kind of things. Depressions in the ground are commonly something you can't really tell from an aerial photograph. Or somebody that works at the site may not even know why there's this 2-foot deep depression in the middle of the property. So that's why we do the site walk. And we also are very familiar with the kinds of conditions that might cause a regulatory agency with jurisdiction to require an action. So those are the 4 elements of the phase one that we do in investigating. And here we are. This is a classic, environmental professionals coming in from, studying a site. We have special equipment. We're very serious. We're scientists, back off. We know what we're doing. So I always love this shot. That's a famous movie among hazardous waste professionals. All right, so here are the benefits of having a phase one or doing a phase one on a transaction. Prior to the property acquisition or transfer or transaction, a phase one is conducted to determine recs. Now, this provides information to the parties involved in the transaction to assess these risks and consider costs to remedy. Sometimes in phase ones, I'll be asked to come up with a cost range to remedy a certain situation. I'll do that, but I'll put it in a separate letter because that's not included in the ASTM protocol. But that's the purpose of the phase one, is to just out all of these issues so everybody's above board with what's going on. So the costs to remedy recs could be minor. It could be something very inexpensive to take care of, or it could be substantial, and it all depends on what the phase one finds. When we get into the project example, you'll see how these things can be small or large in terms of cost issues. Now, phase ones are typically not required for residential transactions, but it's often a good idea to have a phase one done, if especially a developer that's doing a large chunk of property. Banks almost always require a phase one for commercial property transactions because those are the properties that are more likely to have experienced or caused contamination on the property. I'll give you a quick horror story. I've got several horror stories that I'm going to sprinkle in here, but residential, I have a friend from high school who bought a house in suburban Houston, big house. These were like 3,000 to 5,000 square foot homes, big, nice neighborhood. And everything was ducky for the first 3 or 4 years until one of her neighbors went to dig a pool. And they found about 4 feet down, they found drill pipe, black soil, all kinds of garbage. And then after the fact, they went in and did a phase one, and the aerial photograph was completely clear that there had been a Gulf drilling supply yard right there where this neighborhood was built. And nobody apparently did a phase one before they built this property, just hoping that nobody would ever dig. So that's been in litigation now for almost 20 years. So the bottom line for getting a phase one done is, what is your cost saving for a lawsuit not filed? If you do a phase one, you're going to know about 99%. Now, there is the small chance that the phase one practitioner could miss something. There's no way we will know if, for example, a farmer buried 5 drums of DDT in 1971 in the middle of the night, unless we do a magnetic survey, which is usually not indicated. So you have to think about that in terms of a phase one, is the way the cost of doing a phase one versus the unknown potential lawsuit that you might have to deal with. And believe me, I've been there in both situations. Now, once the phase one is prepared and we've made our determination of recognized environmental conditions, this is assuming we found something. The majority of phase ones find nothing. And so you just file your phase one in the file. Everybody can move forward with confidence that there's no issues on the property and everybody's happy. But if we do find some things, there's several things that can happen. The phase two, which is basically taking the next step to verify or refute what you found in the phase one. This is usually drilling and sampling, where we collect soil and or groundwater samples, run them through the laboratory to determine if there are contaminants present in concentrations that would require an action. The state has got lots of trigger levels for just about every chemical you can imagine. So when I perform the phase two, we're looking at the laboratory data to determine if we have anything to be concerned about. A local example of that is the jail site, which there's a group that's trying to say that it's a horribly contaminated site. And I've reviewed the data, and there's very, very minor contamination there, nothing above action levels with the regulatory agency. So, that people can use these in various ways. You can use your data. Another thing you can do after a phase one is remote sensing. This is typically a magnetic survey or ground penetrating radar. This is most commonly done to look for underground objects like old tanks or buried drums. Our project example, you're going to see some of how magnetic sensing works. And that's non-destructive. That's basically just having Dave walk across the site with an EM61 mag detector, and boom, you've got your data. Now, lead and asbestos, this is something that you guys are all very familiar with as realtors. Lead and asbestos surveys are not included in a phase one. They are specifically excluded from a phase one survey. The reason for that is that lead and asbestos surveys have a completely different set of certification requirements and legalities that it just does not happen during the phase one. Now, I've done a phase one and off the record told the client, hey, this is an old building, you really should do a lead and asbestos survey, but they probably already know that. So I just wanted to point that out, that lead and asbestos are specifically excluded from a phase one scope. Gas stations. So gas stations and dry cleaners are the biggest issues we run into in most areas when it comes to contamination sources. Now, the beauty part about gas stations, and I've got a whole other presentation about creative reuses of gas station buildings, but here's just a couple of examples right here in Prescott, and you all know these sites. The top one is Scooters on Gurley, and that's a classic old gas station that's been turned into a restaurant or a coffee shop. Very common. And the reason that these buildings often get reused is they're very sturdy. The construction of a gas station, they were usually modular construction, and they're quite sturdy, and they've almost always got parking around them. So they lend, and they're on main roads with visibility. So they lend themselves very well for reuse and remodeling of the property. On the bottom, we've got the Jeep shop that's over on Sheldon. And that's one where they took a gas station and added a couple of buildings to the side of it to have more capacity. And this is a case of a build. I mean, they're not selling coffee here. They're still working on vehicles. So they are still using a certain amount of hazardous materials and waste, lubricants, in the work that they do. But they don't have underground tanks anymore. At least I hope they don't. So another kind of site, here's another site right here in Prescott that everybody's very familiar with, is the old Santa Fe rail yard. Beautiful building right there on Sheldon. Now behind it, where Sprouts is, and you're looking at that parking lot in the bottom photo, pre-1982, that was a rail yard, a very large and busy rail yard. Rail yards include all kinds of nasty sources for contamination. Creosote dip pits for railroad ties is usually the worst offender. Fueling areas. If it's a really old one, like the one here in Prescott, it probably had coal bins, and coal bin residue can be an issue. Lubrication, maintenance of trains, storage of materials. The thing about a train yard and train tracks is that anywhere you stick a shovel in the ground where there's a train track that's been there for a few decades, you're going to find contamination because rail cars leak, diesel tanks leak, creosote ties, big problem. So anytime I see an old rail yard like this, it always makes me wonder. Now in 1982, when this one was built, there were very few companies doing phase ones at that point. So my guess is that nobody ever did a phase one on this property. They just graded it, built the parking lot and the shopping center, and you're good. I find it just kind of ironic and funny that there's a chance that there's a big pool of creosote 20 feet below the organic produce at Sprouts. So I'm not saying that there is, but I've never seen a phase one for this. Rail yards, a great example of a site, a type of site that can be concerning. Okay, so I've had people ask me before, well, can I just look at the Superfund site list and know if I've got a problem? Okay, Superfund sites are federal sites. Superfund is a fund that is part of the CERCA law, and that's a federal contamination law that was designed to go after contaminated sites that had no remaining responsible party. In other words, abandoned hazardous waste sites. And there are hundreds of them in the United States. The program, they identify sites, they do investigations, they rank the importance of doing cleanup because there's not enough money in the world to clean them all up. But it does clean up the high-risk sites, the ones that are in populated areas, they spend more money on. And here in Yavapai County, we've only got one active Superfund site, and it's the Iron King Mine and Humboldt Smelter over in Dewey-Humboldt. Most of you know about this site. It's an old mine, very common type of site, especially in the West. And that particular site is very typical of sites in Arizona. There are 25 other sites in Yavapai County that show up on the Superfund list, but these are all sites that have been either delisted or archived. That means they've done a risk analysis on them and determined that they don't require any further action. So the contaminants at the Iron King Mines and Smelter site, it's as you would expect, it's metals, primarily arsenic, lead, and zinc. Over the past 15 years, they've done a targeted remediation of 25 to 30 residential yards out there that they dig the top foot of soil off that's contaminated, ship it off for disposal, and then they replace it with clean soil, soil that's not impacted by the mine. They do this in residential yards mainly because that's where kids are more likely to encounter it, and kids are a sensitive population. People in my business call this the Johnny Eat Dirt scenario. So you want to protect from the Johnny Eat Dirt scenario by getting the dirt out of the residential yards. But the site is basically, there's part of the site that they covered with a kind of an encapsulant so that the dust won't blow. That's a big issue, is the dust. And then of course, drainage carries the contaminants off the site into a local creek that eventually goes to the Agua Fria River. Now they built a dam along that creek to catch the contaminated sediments before they get to the Agua Fria. So just so you know, the one Superfund site we have in our county is it's in an extended monitoring phase, and it's very well contained and identified. If you're going to sell a house right in the middle of Dewey-Humboldt, you're probably going to need to know about this. Now, there's also programs at the state level, and I'm just mentioning two here. There are several. I didn't go into the voluntary cleanup program. There's several cleanup programs, but WOARF and LPST are the biggest ones. Now, I'm sorry, I'll cover that acronym. So ADEQ's Water Quality Assurance Revolving Fund, WOARF. It acts like Superfund on the state level. This is the kind of site that it doesn't rise to the level of federal Superfund cleanup. It's not that bad, but it's bad enough that the state wants to deal with it. And it's usually because it impacts groundwater, because we rely on groundwater so much in the state for our water source. So there's two sites in Yavapai County, one each in Cottonwood and Prescott. And both of these cases are related to dry cleaning solvents in the ground and groundwater. Dry cleaners are an emerging problem we're finding because number one, they were everywhere. Number two, they tended to not dispose of their spent solvents in an environmentally conscious way before the late 70s, early 80s. And TCE, PCE, trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, which are the dry cleaning solvents that you smell in your clothes, those are really nasty solvents when they get into the subsurface because they don't eventually self-remediate like petroleum, gasoline type contaminants do. So a dry cleaning site is basically forever. So those are the kind of sites that WOARF goes at. I'd say probably 80% of the sites in the state are WOARF sites in the state are chlorinated solvents, which is dry cleaning solvents. Also chip manufacturing, like the largest site we have in the state is the Motorola plume down at 52nd Street in Phoenix. That's a huge plume. It covers about 22 square miles. So anyway, the WOARF program covers everything like Superfund does, but it's typically dry cleaning sites that you see. Everybody's, I hope, is aware of ADEQs. Oh, and ADEQ stands for the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, by the way, if I didn't specify that. The Leaking Petroleum Storage Tank program has been around since the 80s. And basically, it takes money from gasoline sellers, part of the gas tax, and it goes into a fund to clean up underground storage tanks. Now, these can be abandoned sites, or they can also be sites with a responsible party. Circle K has probably 30 people in their program just dealing with remediation of Circle K sites in the southwestern states. So these are usually USTs that have leaked, most commonly gas stations and garages, gasoline and diesel. Sometimes commercial or industrial sites. I worked on a site down in Phoenix that was a company that tested aircraft engines. It was near Sky Harbor Airport, and they had their own jet fuel tanks, so their tanks had leaked. So that was an example of a commercial or industrial site. But it's typically your corner gas station that has been the offender. Yavapai County has dozens of cases on file. Phoenix and Tucson have hundreds of cases on file. Underground storage tanks, leaking underground storage tanks are the most common thing we find in the performance of phase ones. Oh, before I get into the project example, let me go back real quickly to Superfund sites. Just so you know, we live in a fairly clean state. California has 114 active Superfund sites, and some of them are hideous. They will never clean them up because there's not enough money in the world to clean them up. They'll just build big fences around them and say, never go here. In Arizona, by contrast, California has 114. Arizona has 14. Little New Mexico next door has 21. Texas has 70. And to compare our 14 with other states, Little Vermont has 14 sites, just like Arizona does. You get a lot more sites in the old industrial areas of the United States, Ohio, Michigan, New York. They've got tons of sites. But the good news is Arizona is generally pretty clean when it comes to those really big, nasty sites. And the vast majority of them are mines, dry cleaning plumes, airports, and military facilities. That's the majority of what you see in Arizona. I wanted to throw that in there. Okay, I'm going to jump into our project example. Now, this is a little bit different than a regular phase one on a single property. I've spent a large chunk of my career working on big infrastructure projects. This particular example is about 3 miles of Interstate 10 in the old village of Picacho between Casa Grande and Tucson. Now, it's not Picacho Peak that you drive by and everybody sees Picacho Peak. This was the village of Picacho, about 6 miles north from the peak. And this is a big corridor study. And the way that I would do a corridor study is I would treat the whole footprint of the project like a single site. And then I would identify individual properties that needed further assessment. So that's what you're going to see here. But the reason I'm using this example, which is slightly different than a normal single site phase one, is that it touches on almost every issue that we usually deal with in a phase one. So bear with me. So on the I-10 project in Picacho, as you know, they've been 6-laning I-10 between Phoenix and Tucson. At Picacho, US 87 meets it there, and you've also got the railroad that comes through. I'll show you a picture in a minute. So it really was going to require, quite a bit of attention in terms of what they were going to have to do and how much footprint it was going to take. So what they finally determined was that 126 parcels, 4 blocks wide, 21 blocks long, right through the heart of the old village, were going to have to go. And they were going to put the new I-10 on top of where the village used to sit, and then replat the land where old I-10 used to sit for future development. The only other time that ADOT ever did this kind of basically gutting a town was in 1973 when they widened US 69 through Mayor. They really try to avoid doing this because it's so disruptive to a community. But this takes a long time, and there's a lot of studies. The time frame on this project from original final project design being set in stone, here's what we're going to build, until the final landowner purchase was 9 years. So it was a long, drawn-out process to get Picacho taken care of. So the project, was a 1960s 4-lane interstate, and it has become a modern 6-lane interstate between Arizona's 2 largest cities. Today, in 2021, the only section that is still not 6-lane between Phoenix and Tucson is through the Gila River Indian community just south of Phoenix, and that project is currently in design. So it'll be 6-lane all the way, just like it's going to be 6-lane all the way to the 69 I-17 north of town. But the problem here was that the village of Picacho was in the path of this curvature correction. And when I show you the map, you'll see what the engineers were up against in correcting this curvature. There were alternatives presented in the environmental assessment to save the village, but they were all deemed unfeasible, mainly because of the geometry of the road needs, the presence of the railroad, and there were a couple of historic properties. There was a historic church that's like 210 years old that they didn't want to disturb the church. So they ended up, with no other choice but to go through town. So the decision was made in 2008 to reroute I-10 through the heart of Old Picacho. So here's the map. Now, I'm sorry about the scale on this, but you can see where we are in the state. The part that we're going to focus on is this square here. This is the heart of the old village. We did phase 1s on these other sections of the project that needed to be done, but the heart of the village right here is what this presentation is about. And this zooms in on it a little bit. Now, the yellow lines you see are the new I-10. And it's hard to tell, but it overlays the map of the old village. I'll show you a better map of the village. The red lines were the old alignment of I-10. And there was this, they called it the double S. There was this S curve here and then an S curve back to align with the railroad right away. And even though it doesn't seem like much, those minor curves like that, there were a ton of accidents, mainly truck accidents on this stretch right at Picacho. So for safety reasons, they had to straighten this thing out. So I was asked to perform a corridor phase 1. And by the way, I did this work with the big company, and I have permission to use all this information. So we did the corridor phase 1 first, where we looked at the whole footprint. And from that, of the 126 parcels, I determined that 26 of them had issues that we needed to deal with. So the other 100 parcels were de facto cleared for purchase by ADOT. So they started buying the other 100 parcels up that didn't have any issues associated with them. But we went forward to the 26, and we did 9 phase 2s on those 26 parcels. After we did site-specific phase 1s on the 26 parcels to determine specific issues. We ended up doing 9 phase 2s, drilling and sampling. 3 properties we did magnetic surveys on. And of course, every property in town had asbestos and lead paint assessments done separately because it's a very old town. So it all depended on the specifics of the property. Originally, we prioritized these properties and staged them for construction phasing. But as it turns out, we were able to get all the environmental work done so that they could just do it as one project phase when they built it. So there's the better picture of the village of Picacho. Upper left, you go to Casa Grande. Lower right, you're on your way to Picacho Peak, Marana, and Tucson. And as you can see, it was just kind of a smattered old little village, houses, a few motels, gas stations, the post office, and the tavern, which I'm going to talk about specifically. And that was the heart of the old city. Now, Picacho Gas and Food Mart, this was the last operating gas station in town on the east end of town. We attacked it first because since it had been in operation for almost 45 years, we were pretty sure it was a leaker. So just to give you an idea of what gas stations look like underneath your feet, this backhoe over here in the corner is sitting on the old asphalt. So it's only about 12 to 18 inches down to the tops of the tanks. Now here, the tops of the tanks have been exposed. They've been bled of all the gas vapors by inserting liquid nitrogen that clears the tanks out so they don't blow up if they rupture. And then we're ready right here for them to dig out the tanks and pop them out of the ground. And yes, that site was one of the ones that was contaminated. Okay, I'm going to call this site Big Vacant Lot. There was this big vacant lot in the middle of, not in the middle, but near the middle of town. And it was big. It was 2.5 acres. And there was nothing there. It was just all dirt. just a dirt lot. And I'm thinking, oh, this will make my life easy. Then we started looking at the historical data, and I'm like, uh-oh, there was a truck stop there from the 50s until about 1978. But I'm looking at this dirt lot, and I'm thinking, well, then everything must have been removed because it just looks like a clean dirt lot. Well, what we found out from doing some interviews was that the owner of the property in the early 80s was being assessed as if the property was developed. Even though he'd torn down the truck stop, he left the pump islands and some of those appurtenances. So the county was taxing him at a developed property rate. So he brought in 100, 150 truckloads of dirt and basically buried the entire property a foot deep. So it looked like there was nothing there. And then after that, the assessor said, oh, undeveloped property, and taxed him at a lower rate. Well, we did a mag survey out here based upon the aerial photograph review that I did. And there you see one of the pump islands that we dug out that was a foot underground. Well, where there's pump islands, you often find tanks. This happens to be the waste oil tank that sat off to the side of the old truck stop. The bad news is it was still there and it was full of oil. The good news was, see how the oil comes right to the top? It hadn't leaked out. At that point, that tank had been underground 30 years and it maintained its integrity. That's kind of unusual because in this country, 82% of every underground storage tank ever put in the ground leaks. So it was kind of surprising to find that one intact. And that we found that with the magnetic survey as well. So then we went back and looked. ADOT has this wonderful tool. They have a video van that drives every mile of every highway in the state every year. And originally they did it to assess pavement condition back in the 60s when they first started doing it. Well, people like me came along and said, wait a minute, I can look at this old video log and it's like I'm driving down the road there in 1971. So I found the piece of film from 1971, and there you go. That's the big vacant lot. To the right, you can see I-10 in its old configuration. This is Camino Adelante, the main road that runs through town. But this big triangular vacant lot here that was covered with a foot of dirt, there's the old truck stop on it. So that's an example of how we time travel basically when we do phase 1 investigations to determine where these nasties might be. So the post office and the tavern, these two buildings were kind of the heart of the old community. The post office was an interesting building because it was built in 61, but it was built on top of the location of the original Butterfield stagecoach stop that served the village prior to the advent of cars. I mean, this was a very historic site. The tavern was basically the heartbeat of Picacho. At one time, it served as the village's post office before they built the post office building. And one of the old timers told me that there used to be a Mobil gas station located near the fence, and he was able to actually walk out of the bar and point to where the old gas station had been. And he said it had been there from the 1940s through the 1960s. So here's on the left, you see the back of the tavern, and along this fence is where he said it was. Now, this photo was taken after we did the mag survey, and you can see the pink dots on the ground. That shows where we had hits on our magnetic survey. So here's what the magnetic survey looks like. The fence is the lower line here, and then you've got a big return and a smaller return, saying that there's something metallic underground right here. And this is basically just on a dirt driveway approach off the highway into the back of the tavern. And then that's what we found when we pulled it out. The smaller tank was completely full of diesel that had to have been sitting there 40 years. Again, that tank didn't fail. However, the larger tank, which was the gasoline tank, had failed. It was completely empty, and we had contaminated soil underneath it. So that was how we, do our wizardry skills of time travel and magnetic surveys to find these kind of features underground. Another old gas station this was an ARCO truck stop in 1971. That's what it looked like in 71. And that's what it looked like in 2010. They had cleverly disguised the pump islands by letting plants grow through the holes where the pumps had been. But just looking at that building, you probably wouldn't guess that had once been a truck stop. But again, our historical research pointed us in that way. This was a very interesting and complicated site. So as you can see, the dark line is a shadow from a big obscure fence, one of those tall metal fences that you can't see through, because inside of it was a towing yard. So there's all these cars parked in there. And I was kind of suspect of this because we had this site down in the lower bottom that I've got my cursor over. And then this site up here had shown up as gas stations in the old aerial photographs. But you couldn't see them from the road because now this big fence had been built. So the one in the upper part of the last photograph, that's what it looked like in 1971. I call it M Mobil. I think it was Marquez Mobil. But that's the old Mobil station in 71. You think, well, 71, it's probably gone by now. Not so much. There it is inside the fence. There's the old gas station building. There's the pump island, and there's the fence that hides it all. On the bottom part of the original photo, this one actually is just outside the towing yard. Everybody called this was Lopez, Texaco. And I got a couple of great stories about how 2 people had been murdered here. It was really a fun story. But anyway, that's the Texaco site, and it sort of faces the old configuration of I-10 because there used to be a street where the access road for I-10 is here back in the day. So that was a very old gas station. So we were told that their tanks were actually to the west. Well, if you go to the west from that building, you're onto the towing yard site. So this is what the mag survey found, and sure enough, there's the tank, or sort of on a diagonal next to where the gas station was right here. That's one great way to keep from having underground storage tank cleanup costs, is to put your tanks on your neighbor's property. But as this worked out, ADOT ended up paying for all of this, but we did find those tanks as well, and there they are coming out of the ground after everything else had been torn down. There they are coming out of the ground. And then I took this picture in October of 2012. I had a little bit of a melancholy twinge looking at this blank piece of dirt that once had had a town. I had found all kinds of contamination issues. I'd gotten to know almost everybody that was left in the town. And it made me a little bit melancholy to see it in October of 2012 just basically be blank dirt, everything gone. And that's where I-10 sits now. If you drive to Tucson, you'll drive right over this on the new freeway. So here's the punchline. And this is how the phase 1, if you perform one, how it protects your buyers and sellers. The ASTM conforming phase 1 is recognized by the EPA and the legal community as the minimum level of investigation required to determine whether contamination risk exists at a property. A properly performed phase 1 ESA by a qualified firm, it's got a shelf life of 180 days, and that's set by EPA. So that's 6 months. If you're going to have a property transaction, you need to get a phase 1 done within 6 months before the transaction. And I don't recommend that you wait until the last 2 weeks, because if we do find something in the phase 1, which takes about a month, it's going to take another 2 or 3 months to perform your phase 2. And then if there's any kind of cleanup, timeline goes out the door. So keep in mind that there are timelines associated with the performance of phase 1 work. Early discovery and full disclosure of potential contamination issues can put both the seller and the buyer on sound footing, knowing what costs and risks might be involved in the property transfer. What will make a deal blow up faster than just about anything else is a haz waste issue that comes up at the last minute, because there's so much unknown in terms of costs and scope on something like that. More data early on reduces the potentially uncomfortable discussions with lawyers later. If you've ever sat through a deposition, I have twice, it's not something you want to do, particularly when it comes to contamination issues, because this protocol exists to basically keep from it going to the point where everybody's suing everybody. So I don't want to, scare you too much, but if you want to reduce your risk and know what's currently unknown, phase 1s are a fairly inexpensive way, to get this information out front and have everybody, happy with what's going on. And I have to tell you, the majority of phase 1s that we perform find nothing. We don't find anything of concern. I actually had a client one time tell me, why am I wasting all this money on phase 1s? And I'm like, well, if you didn't do them, you would spend 500 times the cost of the phase 1 in a cleanup. So isn't this cheap insurance for you to perform this phase 1 investigation? So with that, this is not a good way to dispose of your hazardous waste, by the way. I just love this picture though for the punch value of it. This is the way they did things back in the 50s and 60s. And this is what I sometimes go and find. But anyway, with that scary picture, I guess I'll close it and open for questions. We got 15 minutes.
Question.
Yes.
This is John. Recently, within the last week, Governor Ducey put out some type of information relative to hazardous waste around the military bases in Arizona?
I would have to look at that. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it was in the news and stuff, and in local papers in Phoenix and stuff.
Military bases are interesting. They almost always have an old dump on the base where they dumped all their parts from aircraft maintenance. They used to put drums of cleaning solvents down in the, just throw them in the ground. They've got fueling issues. Some bases that were involved in more, shall I say, exotic activities have contaminants that make it off the base. We've also got the bombing ranges in Arizona, the Goldwater bombing range and the Army test facility just outside Yuma. I've done projects on Highway 95 out there that go through the Army Proving Ground, and we will find explosive remnants of test bombs that wash down through the washes underneath the highway. Now, it's not explosive anymore, but it's the kind of thing that will certainly stop a construction contractor in his tracks. So I got certified in an unexploded ordnance assessment years ago. But yeah, we do have a rather robust variety of issues with our military bases here in the state. Anybody else? Don't be afraid. I know you've probably got a transaction on your desk right now that you're thinking, you can just say, an imaginary site, and I won't press you.
Around the Humboldt site,
Yeah.
what's the distance out from that site that one should be concerned about?
Well, that's a great question. They've got a fence around the perimeter of what is considered to be the quote operable unit. This is the unit that they are monitoring. Once you get outside the fence, technically EPA says you're safe once you're outside the fence. People live all around outside the fence. Now, everybody has a different threshold of their concern level. You'll get people that will absolutely freak out and not want to buy a property within 10 miles of it. You'll get other people that will buy right next to the fence because they're getting a deal. So that's a hard question to answer. But when they have a perimeter fence, the EPA has determined that inside the fence is a health risk, outside the fence is not. There are exceptions to that. The Libby asbestos site in Montana. Libby, Montana was a huge asbestos mining town for decades, and it's naturally occurring in the rocks there. So anywhere you go around Libby, you're exposed to asbestos. But the actual operable unit at Libby is limited. So that's a case where it does extend beyond the fence. But here in Arizona, the fence is the limit.
I just took a class on this yesterday, Friday, and they said the EPA tested on the Dewey Humboldt site, and they found contaminants as far away as 22 miles.
Right. So contaminants is something you have to understand the word. A contaminant is something that is not natural in its environment. Actionable concentrations of a contaminant are a completely different thing. And that's what the regulatory agencies look at. Is it high enough that they need to do a cleanup? The thing about smelters and the old Humboldt smelter is that the contaminations went out the stack. Lead in dust came out the stacks of those smelters, and they were air deposited in a very large area. So the question you have to ask is, okay, what's actionable? What levels of contamination from the smelter are actionable? In the EPA data, which is available online, you can see their very large array of sampling locations, and you can see where it's hotter than in other places. But that's all covered and well explained in the EPA website about each site. Smelters, indeed, you're correct. Smelters do carry their contaminants further. But then again, the question becomes, is it an actionable concentration?
They cleaned up 26 yards, households near that, down 6 feet. They had to go down, remove the soil and bring it clean.
6 feet. I thought it was a foot.
6 feet, he said.
Yeah, lead is not terribly mobile. Once lead hits the surface, it's not soluble in water, so you can dump rain on it all day long. It basically just becomes how well it adheres to the soil. So considering that Dewey Humboldt has got very porous soil, I could see how they would need to go deeper. There's a huge lead site in West Dallas in Texas that covers square mile after square mile. And they've done multiple studies out there, and the lead only extends down about 8 inches. So when they were doing the yard cleanups there, and they did over 400 on that site, they only went down a foot. But that's a good point.
I have a question.
Yes.
Could you, I know it's probably not part of a phase 1 scope, but could you talk a little bit about the naturally occurring arsenic in our area and
Oh,
also the naturally occurring radon that happens?
I would love to tell you about those things. Arsenic is one of those things that people will pull out of their hat when they really want to stir up a problem. Here's the deal. Arsenic is an extremely common element. It's in rocks, just about everywhere you go. Where you need to be concerned about arsenic, though, is when it is liberated from its matrix. In other words, when arsenic becomes soluble in water and you can drink it. Understanding that our bodies need a certain amount of arsenic to be healthy. Everybody hears the word arsenic and they freak out because of, thank you, Agatha Christie, arsenic and old lace. They think of it as a poison. And it certainly can be a poison. But arsenic occurs just about everywhere. And again, it all depends on concentration. I used to teach a toxicology class, and how I would explain toxicology to people was tequila. 1 tequila is a tonic. 2 tequilas is a tonic. 15 tequilas is a poison. So that's the way you have to think about arsenic, is mobility and dose. Radon is a naturally occurring, very mildly radioactive gas, and it occurs very commonly in granites. Well, here we are, we've got granite everywhere. I did a lot of specific radon assessments back in the 90s when it first became an issue. What we figured out after about 5 years of doing these assessments for radon is the remedy is always the same: ventilate. Because you can't remediate radon at the source. It's coming out of the ground. It's coming out of the granite. So where it was a problem was when you had closed basements that had some kind of a porous base that was letting them in. I did a bunch of this up in Utah, and the way they would construct their concrete basements was they had joints in them. Well, the radon was coming up through the joints. So you could do one of two things. You could seal your joints, or you could seal your joints and ventilate the basement. So radon sort of fizzled as a major issue in the 90s because we figured out that it's an easily addressable issue just with ventilation. Nowadays, buildings, commercial and residential buildings that are built in known radon areas, they just put down a vapor barrier, a plastic vapor barrier under the slab. Sometimes they'll put passive ventilation in it with a solar powered fan that pulls air out from under your foundation to remove the radon. But radon was a big deal in the 90s. We kind of figured out, it's not really that big a deal. There's a few locations where you've got a really serious radon problem, but it's like a 1 in a million shot. So that's my treatise on arsenic and radon. Anybody else? Nobody's asked me how much a phase 1 costs.
Somebody asked in the chat.
Oh, okay. So a basic phase 1, a stripped down, fairly simple site, not a great big site, phase 1, probably is going to be around $2,500 for most providers. The costs go up from there based upon the size of the property, the complexity of the property. I did a phase 1 on a former GM manufacturing plant in Chicago one time, and it was $38,000 just to do the phase 1. But that was the kind of property that took us days and days and days to identify all the issues at this former manufacturing plant. Around Prescott, you're looking at the lower end, $2,500 to $3,500 probably to do a property, and it varies from provider to provider. But that's what I charge. I start at $2,500. Understand too that phase 1s, some firms look at phase 1s as a lawsuit machine, because if you don't do your phase 1 properly, who are both parties going to go after if something goes south? The person that prepared the phase 1. So that's why I'm always been very careful. When I was with the big company for all those years, I trained every phase 1 practitioner that company had. We had about 250 people nationwide, and I trained every last one of them to do phase 1s totally according to the letter of the law.
How
I
much
have a
different-
question.
Yeah.
So there's a commercial property out here in Chino that had what looked like core samples being taken.
Okay.
It almost looked like a well driller's rig.
Okay.
And they were very hush hush. They wouldn't tell anybody what they were doing, not even the property owner. And then they ended up with this blue machine contraption on the property. And I'm curious what the heck that could be.
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, when you see a drill rig, it's one of three things. They're either doing environmental drilling, looking for contamination.
Mhm.
They're doing geotechnical drilling to determine if the soil can hold the weight of whatever they're going to build there, or they're drilling a well.
They
Those are
went through concrete and they did it in like 12 different spots.
That sounds like some kind of a contamination investigation.
It used to be a gas station.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
sorry,
then that's what
I
they were
didn't
doing.
say that.
They might have been doing what's called a soil gas survey, where they drill holes and they just put a probe down in, they suck vapor, soil vapor out of the soil, put it in a plastic bag and run it through the lab to determine if there's vapor there. A soil gas survey is a more inexpensive way to assess a site than putting in, temporary monitoring wells. So that sounds like a soil vapor survey. Was it that gas station that was on the west side of the road, kind of on the south end of town?
No.
Okay.
It's
I know that station
Chino on
because-
the west side.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like they were doing a soil gas survey.
But what would the machine that they put in afterwards be for?
So that could have been a temporary remedial system. So if they did find some impacts in the soil, some vapor in the soil that needed to be remediated, they basically put a big machine out there that just sucks vapor through, and they try to ventilate it all out. And then what they'll do is they'll run that for a while, then they'll shut it down and let things stabilize for a while. Then they'll go back in and collect more samples. And that's kind of an inexpensive short-term way to deal with a minor contamination issue and satisfy ADEQ.
It was
sounds
almost
you're
a
describing
year.
soil vapor survey.
The samples took them almost a year. They just kept coming back and doing more, and then they'd leave and then they'd come back.
Did the machine come
interesting
back several
process.
times?
Oh, yeah. No, this is the first time we've seen the machine,
Yeah.
but it's fenced around and it's very secure.
So if they were getting results that were like close to an action level,
Mhm.
rather than spend the money to come out and do the remediation, they may have just been saying, well, we'll see if it dissipates, and they'll come back and sample again, because sampling is
Got
not
it.
expensive.
Got
That
it.
sounds like what they were doing. Very common. You see it all the time.
We've all been curious what it is.
How much do phase twos run?
Boy, that's like asking how long is a piece of string. If I'm going to drill and sample 3 holes, not going to be terribly expensive. If it's a large property with several different issues, and I've got a complicated laboratory protocol to assess all the issues, it could be $50,000, $60,000, $80,000. So phase 2s cost more than a phase 1, but is it 2 times the phase 1 or is it 20 times the phase 1? It depends on the issues that we're having to address. You can tell though, after you've done the phase 1, you can get an order of magnitude of what the phase 2 is likely to cost. Good question.
Kelly, what's the turnaround time on a phase 1?
A phase 1, I mean, we like to get 3 to 4 weeks. That gives us time to very thoroughly review all the historical data. If you're coming up against a closing though, and I mean, we can compress that schedule down to as short as, I don't want to put too short on here to put myself in a corner, because as soon as I say 10 days, you're going to expect every phase 1 to be 10 days. They can be done if it's a simple property. They can be done in 10 to 12 days. But we really prefer to get more like 3 or 4 weeks to have time to really review the data. Also, with the COVID, ADEQ's file room has been very slow in returning files in some cases. So that has slowed us down a little bit in the last year. But yeah, typically call it 2 to 4 weeks is typical. We also have the issue of access. Now, if you've got a property where the party that owns it really doesn't want to let you on to look around, that can certainly cause a delay until you get that negotiated. I've been run off with a gun before. It's part of the show. Anybody? We got 2 more minutes. Well, let me just wrap up then by saying that I love weird questions. Kind of makes my day. So I didn't put my phone number up on the screen or anything, but all you have to do is look up K2 site assessments. If you want to write my number down, it's 602-708-1993. Again, 602-708-1993. And I'll give away some information for free.
How about email?
But sorry?
Email?
My email is Kelly Kading, no punctuation, KELLY-KADING at K2, the number 2, site, SITE, assessments.com.
It is in the chat box as well, Anne.
Oh, good. But I still have clients from down in Phoenix. I have clients from when I lived in New Mexico 25 years ago that sometimes will call me up. Hey, Kelly, I found this. What do you think? So I'm more than happy to try to point people in the right direction. But if you're going to need an assessment, I'm going to need a contract.
Do you require like half up front or something?
Yeah, if it's somebody I haven't worked for before, I like to get half up front. I mean, most of the work that I do is for ADOT. I'm pretty sure they're going to pay me, but with private parties, you know, I'll do half up front. My client at ADOT, I have to point this out too. The guy that runs the hazmat program for ADOT started at ADOT in 1962. He's the longest serving state of Arizona employee in the history of the state. The man is 81 years old. Everybody knows him and loves him, and he knows where every skeleton is buried. But as residents of the state of Arizona, you should be thrilled that a guy like Ed Green is in that position, because he runs that program very cost efficiently. And I just love working with Ed. That's my plug for ADOT. But yeah, private parties, I do like to see half up front. There's a few parties that I won't work with. I usually don't work directly with banks. Banks don't want to pay you anything. And they basically look at phase ones as, you know, a license to sue. So typically if the client is directly going to be a bank, I'll walk away. But private parties, sure.
I bought a building in Vermont, built in 1885. And it had been a funeral home, a church, a funeral home, a church, a funeral home, and then in 67 became a 4-unit building.
Wow.
And I bought it and owned it for 15 years, and the sump pump was getting full of oil.
Oh, no.
And
Yeah.
I had done all my inspection of the property, and I saw that there was something in the front of the building that looked like used to fill up oil, but there was a 250-gallon oil tank in the basement.
Oh my.
So I thought, okay, we're covered. Well, this was built underneath the house and someone put an addition over it. And
Yeah.
it was put in 1943. It was made of tin from Canada. They snuck it in. It was a riot because they cut it open and crawled in and scrubbed it all out after they got the oil out. The VOCs were really low. It was not flammable. And they were all out there trying to figure out their high school geometry on what size this tank was, because it was 3 feet high and 7 feet across, and it was round. And
First time they'd ever used pie, probably.
yeah. So yeah, it was bizarre, and nobody knew it was there.
I tell you what, I could bore you for hours with horror stories like that. Let me just throw out there though, that if anybody wants to buy me a beer, I will tell you the story of the Baltimore site. It had been an acid manufacturing plant, fertilizer manufacturing plant, nerve gas manufacturing plant. And when I looked at it, the guy was running an illegal hazardous waste storage facility. So I'll tell you the full story for the cost of a beer. Okay, I think I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a great presentation. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it, and we had great questions too. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We hope to have you back again, Kelly, hopefully very
Let's see,
soon.
I've done water availability and hazardous waste. Can I do my next one on classic cars? Because
Absolutely.
that's really about all I know about.
Well, those are two very important things, in my opinion, and my husband's as well. By the way, the Scooters coffee place used to be my husband's shop a long time ago.
Really?
Yep. And
see, that's the beauty part too about doing phase ones in a small town. Tons of information. You just have to find the right people.
Well, and the gentleman from ABQ was coming up and drilling in the parking lot. We didn't own it. We were renting it.
Yeah.
And one time my daughter was visiting us. She ended up working with this gentleman at ADEQ. She's still there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's a small world, and she's doing great there. She does a lot of the same. She's doing a lot of the phase ones and phase twos in this area right now. So when you see something,
If anybody has a
her.
question that we didn't have time for, feel free to shoot me an
Yeah.
email or give me a call. We've got the information.
Yes, and let's keep in contact with each other, Kelly, and do
Sure.
something else, maybe another class about this again. Okay?
Okay.
Thanks again, everybody. Hope you have a great day.
Do it on beer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kelly.
I could do
We should
that.
have a happy hour, beer happy hour, and you could tell us all about the Baltimore site.
I actually know more about scotch than beer. So,
Oh, okay. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a
Thanks.
wonderful
Thank you.
day. Thanks again, Kelly.
you bet.